Okay. So before I get started, one little bit of housekeeping. I'm flying back to Vancouver on Friday just for the weekend, so there will be no office hours on Friday. I know it's the day before the test, but I'm telling you now so you can come to office hours today or Wednesday. Friday, of course, is test review day. So try to test yourself on the key terms ahead of time, and then you'll know which things you don't know. I'll be giving you some information today that may help you narrow your studying. So we're on the last chapter before the test, and that's chapter 3 on egoism, specifically psychological egoism. So the prior chapter, Tiberius argues that morality or niceness is to some extent innate. But there's a popular view that many lay people hold, even if they haven't thought about it very much, which is psychological egoism. This is the view that all human motivation is ultimately selfish. So humans may sometimes do nice things, but ultimately it's always motivated by some kind of selfish motive or desire. It's called psychological egoism because it's a descriptive claim. It's not saying this is good or bad, it's just saying this is how people in fact work. Yes?
Do you call that equivalent to all voluntary actions are caused by desires?
No, so all voluntary actions are caused by desires is something that the paper, I forget if that's in the paper or the book, but the authors are going to say that's probably true, but they're going to take great effort to distinguish that from psychological egoism. So I'll get to that in a bit. But no, so it's not the same as psychological egoism. Now, if this is right, many traditional moral theories can't be right. So remember I talked about Kant? According to Kant, a good action is only good if you do it from based on your understanding that it's right. You shouldn't do it because you enjoy doing it, and certainly not out of any egoistic motivation. You should do it just because you want to do what's right, and you, through the use of reason, have apprehended that this action is right. So if psychological egoism is right, some moral theories are going to be in trouble. So one thing that the paper or the book makes great effort to argue for is that this is an empirical claim. Sometimes it's defended as if it's true by definition, but Tiberius argues that it's not true by definition. So we have to distinguish between, we've made similar distinctions already, but we have to distinguish between conceptual truths and empirical truths. There's different ways of dividing this up. The paper uses a different term that I'll mention in passing, but with a somewhat different meaning. But the basic idea is there are some things we can know to be true simply by thinking about them. They're simply true as a matter of definition. So for example, take the sentence, all bachelors are unmarried. You don't have to do any empirical or observational investigation of the world to find out that's true. The word bachelor just means, something like unmarried male. So saying all bachelors are unmarried is a conceptual truth. It's just true by definition. Saying that there are 27 moons around orbiting Saturn, that's an empirical, well, in that case it's not true, but okay, there's one moon orbiting the Earth, that's an empirical fact. You can't figure out that's true by sitting down and thinking about it. You have to point the telescope to find out. And of course, there are various empirical claims about human beings that you can make about human psychology. Now, someone just asked about this. There is a claim that arguably is a conceptual truth, and that's what this person asked about. all voluntary actions are caused by desires. You can make a good case that that's just true by definition. To say that something is voluntary, you could argue, is basically to say that they wanted to do it. They weren't coerced into doing it. Their choosing to do it arose out of desires that they acted on. In other words, you don't have to do empirical investigation to find out whether that's true. But psychological egoism is not saying that all voluntary actions are caused by desires. It's saying all voluntary actions are caused by a specific kind of desire, namely, a desire to benefit oneself. So one of the readings is a more detailed treatment of, well, I guess actually before that, I'll just say that with regard to the book, the reason that Tiberius wants to move it into being an empirical question is because then the defender of psychological egoism has to present evidence for it. They can't just appeal to intuition or definition, they have to do some kind of empirical investigation. And typically, people who defend psychological egoism haven't actually done the work to demonstrate it. And I'll note as well, the burden of proof for something like psychological egoism is very high. Because it's not saying humans are often selfish, or even mostly selfish, but that all human motivation is selfish. And whenever, in any science, but especially psychology, any claim prefaced with the word all, you need very strong evidence to back that up. Even a single counterexample can disprove it. Yeah.
Sorry, just backing up a little bit. So did Kant argue that it was actually possible to do something only because it's right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think his view would imply that it is possible.
It is
yes. So the paper that looks at egoism in more detail starts out by distinguishing a couple of different senses of the term egoism. One which I've already mentioned, which is psychological egoism. Another view, and don't worry about this, it's just another term you may see in the literature. Oh, yes.
Sorry, I feel like I've gotten a little bit confused.
Oh, no worries, yeah. I'm sure you're not the only one. Speak your confusion.
For psychological egoism, it is an empirical claim?
Yes, that's what Tiberius argues, that it is an empirical claim. You can't figure out that it's true just by thinking about it.
How so? I feel like I'm confused on that.
So in order to show, so motivations are things that people have, right? People have motivational states in their head. And we can at least imagine people have, like, here's one way to say it. A truth that is a conceptual truth, you should be unable to imagine it being any other way. So for example, you can't imagine a married bachelor. It's just a contradiction. You can't even imagine such a thing. We could at least imagine a being that was purely altruistic. You can imagine, I don't know, God making a being who didn't care about itself at all and only cared about other people. So in a case like that, where we can imagine it being either way, we have to do empirical investigation to find out. We have to look at, do people in fact only have selfish motivations? So you can do studies, psychology studies to find out, but the author of the book wants to say it's an empirical question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank
you. So another sense of egoism is ethical egoism. This one always struck me as kind of goofy. This is saying that the morally right thing is to be selfish. There are some people who defend that. I never quite knew what to do with that, but that is something that it mentions. Additionally, and later on, the paper talks a bit more about this. One specific variant of psychological egoism is a hedonistic type. So hedonism means having to do with pleasure. So this is a more specific kind of egoism that says the only motivation we have is to increase our own pleasure. And pleasure being defined broadly as any, well, there's different definitions, but any positive state, any positive psychological state. We'll see later, there's also, hedonistic versions of utilitarianism, right? So utilitarianism would be, you should maximize the happiness of everyone impartially. Yes?
Sorry, can you repeat hedonistic?
Just having to do with pleasure. So hedonistic psychological egoism would be, we are only motivated to increase our own pleasure. So it's a specific kind of egoism. Okay, so the next page has some common claims that everyday people make in defense of psychological egoism. I'll go through them as examples. So one thing people sometimes say is, every action of mine is prompted by motives or desires that are my motives. And if they're my motives, they must be selfish in some way. Again, I don't think these are not intended to be good arguments. These are just claims you sometimes hear people make. Another claim is that people get pleasure every time they get something that they want. Therefore, the desire must be aimed at getting that pleasure. Another one, this one's maybe more substantive. We know that people often engage in self-deception about their motives, and often present their motives in ways to make themselves look good. So something that may look like a moral or altruistic motivation may in fact be a selfish one, because we know people are capable of engaging in self-deception. I mean, I can just say with that last one, again, it's conceptually possible that all motivation is selfish and that it's just self-deception. But in order to demonstrate that, you'd have to do a lot of empirical evidence, because egoism is claiming that in every case, something that where there's something that looks like a moral motivation, it's in fact a selfish one. So I've already mentioned this when talking about the book, but there's a term I'll add to it. So Feinberg in this paper distinguishes the claim that all voluntary actions are caused by desires from the claim that all voluntary actions are caused by selfish desires. And people sometimes move from one to the other. It's like, well, premise one, all voluntary actions are caused by desires, and you can even say, desires that belong to the agent. And then they'll kind of smuggle in and say, well, therefore, so same thing, all voluntary actions are caused by selfish desires. And it should be obvious when you state it that plainly that this is what philosophers call a non sequitur. Anyone, a philosophy background, can anyone tell me what a non sequitur is? So it just means it does not follow. So you start with premises, you draw a conclusion, but the conclusion does not logically follow from the premises. Another thing the paper discusses, and this one is not, I'm not going to spend as much time connecting this to his argument against hedonism or against egoism, but it's a term you might see elsewhere, and that's the paradox of hedonism. This is actually a really practical thing to keep in mind for various things in life. The paradox of hedonism says that if you want to be a good hedonist, if you want to actually successfully pursue pleasure, you should not consciously aim at seeking it. If you do, you probably won't get it. In other words, if you consciously think to yourself, I need to get pleasure, I want pleasure, you'll probably wind up, doing a lot of drugs or something. And your life, in fact, will wind up being not so pleasurable. If you want to have a happy life, you probably shouldn't consciously think to yourself, I want to be very happy and have lots of pleasure. You should aim at things like, productivity, having friends, having fun hobbies or whatever, and then happiness or pleasure comes along for the ride. You can think of something similar for, trying to fall asleep. If you want to fall asleep, you should not consciously think to yourself, I really want to fall asleep. And if you've tried that, it's not a good strategy. Okay, I've gone on for a bit. Any questions about what I've said so far? Okay. Feinberg then takes aim specifically at hedonistic psychological egoism. So the view that what we are always aiming at is pleasure. Now, there's two different senses of the term pleasure, and what Feinberg argues is no matter which one you go for, this view comes across as pretty absurd. The first one for empirical reasons, the second one for conceptual reasons. You could define, and some philosophers do define, pleasure as a sensation or a kind of conscious state. So I think, I forget if I took this from the book, but you could call this pleasure one if you like. I definitely won't have that on the test. I think he might use that term in the paper. If you define pleasure as a sensation, that means you define it as kind of an inner good feeling. So think of what it feels like when you bite into buttered chicken, or if you take substances that you shouldn't take, that good feeling. Well, whatever your favorite sensation is, those would all be examples of pleasure in this sense. So if you define pleasure that way, that means people are always motivated to get that. And here, the empirical case against it is overwhelming, given that egoism means it's always the case. You can find cases of martyrs, right? People who die for some cause, even people who don't believe in an afterlife and who are willing to get tortured, etc., and die for the sake of the cause they're committed to. So you watch this person, burning alive for this belief they're defending, and you say, look at that. He's motivated to get pleasure. That's what you're committed to if you're an egoist. And it seems to be the case that if that doesn't count as empirical refutation of egoism in this sense, then nothing will. So the empirical case against this being always true is, I think, overwhelming. The other sense of pleasure, which runs into a very different sort of problem, you can define it as satisfaction. And satisfaction, that is, of desires. So some utilitarians are inclined to go this way, where pleasure is just getting what you want. This is, frankly, kind of different from how we define it in ordinary language, but some philosophers define it that way. Well, then you run into what philosophers call an infinite regress. You run into a kind of circular definition. So you say, okay, people are always motivated to achieve pleasure. Well, what's pleasure? Satisfying their desires. What do they desire? Pleasure. What's pleasure? Well, it's satisfying your desires. So it becomes empty. If you define pleasure in this way, you have a circular definition. Okay, so the next pair of terms is analytic and synthetic. And I was going to say this earlier, but I'll say it now. Feinberg and the Batson articles, here's a free gift. None of those terms will be definition questions on the test. But they could be relevant to one of the written. So you can kind of pick and choose. I'll just say, there will be a question on psychological egoism. So you can use different resources from either of the Batson articles or the Feinberg article, but if there's a term or two that you're like, I don't know what this means, none of those will be definition questions on the test. So I'll just say, analytic and synthetic statement is basically the same as the distinction between conceptual truth and empirical truths. Synthetic is a bit more broad than empirical, but that's probably good enough. Since you won't be tested on them, I won't give you a headache with the difference there. Okay, two final issues that he brings up. One is that the term selfish, saying someone is selfishly motivated, normally implies moral blame. When you say you're being selfish in ordinary speech, what that means is you're doing something that we should morally condemn. But again, we have lots of cases of people doing things like giving all of their money or most of their money to charity. And if someone comes along and says, well, that's selfish, and they have some weird self-deception type explanation for why it's ultimately selfish, well, saying that it's selfish commits you to saying that what they're doing is morally wrong, which seems to, which presents a problem for defining selfish in that way. Now, the final thing the paper says, this is one move the egoists could potentially make. They could say, well, I'm defining selfish in a way that's different from ordinary language. I'm kind of making it into a technical term that just includes any motivation that the agent has. And there's nothing per se wrong with doing that. Remember back in one of the first classes we talked about conceptual engineering, how you can change the meaning of a term if it's useful in some way. And there's no law that says thou must not, put forward a new definition of a term. So it's not wrong to do this, but when you're creating a new term or taking an existing term and changing the meaning, the question is it useful to do so? Does it achieve any theoretical purpose? Does it make our theorizing more fruitful? And what Feinberg says is it's not clear there's any point in changing the meaning of this or putting forward a new definition of it such that it includes all human motivations. Okay. Any questions on the Feinberg paper? Okay, I'm looking at the key terms for the book. I realize I missed a few that were higher up. I'll just briefly cover those. So, many people in the social contract tradition were sympathetic to something like psychological egoism. So I mentioned Thomas Hobbes, for example. He thought that people were kind of intrinsically selfish, and that what we do when we create states and codes is we're kind of leveraging their selfishness against them. We're saying, look, if you do these terrible things, the state will come and put you in a cage. So let's all abide by the social contract, and we'll all be better off for it. I believe I said this in passing in another chapter, but the reason I mention Aristotle in the key terms is Aristotle has a very different conception of moral motivation than Kant, where Kant thinks that you should do something good only because you believe it's good, because you apprehend through reason that it's good, whereas Aristotle says, no, if you enjoy doing good, that's part of what it means to be a virtuous person. You want to become the sort of person who enjoys being kind, generous, etc. We'll come back to that when we talk about virtue ethics in chapter 9. Okay. Next section, another pair of terms that are good to know. Tiberius distinguishes between an instrumental desire and an ultimate desire. This is one argument that people have put forward or you can use this to put forward an argument for egoism that's maybe a little more plausible. I think it's still subject to the sorts of problems I've mentioned, but here's the distinction. There's some things that we desire for instrumental reasons. Meaning, we don't desire them in themselves. We desire them because they get us something else that we want. So for example, presumably most of you want money. You desire money. Now, it's not that you look at the number on your banking app and think, ooh, X money, wow, that's so great. What you like about it is it gets you other things that you want, like food and housing and etc. So desire for money would be an example of an instrumental desire. You desire it because it gets you something else. Ultimate desires relate to things you desire for themselves. So they're the kind of basis of your instrumental desires. And one common argument for something like egoism, often for hedonistic egoism, is if you keep asking why do you want that, eventually you wind up with something like because it makes me happy. So if I say, why do you want money? You say, oh, well, I want to be able to have a house and have food. Why do you want that? Well, being homeless and hungry, I don't want that. Well, why don't you want that? Well, because then I'm unhappy, I'm in pain and cold. Why is it bad to be in pain and cold? And you kind of just say, cause. So that would be an example of you arriving at an ultimate desire. So the desire to not be cold and in pain would be something you desire for itself. You don't desire it because it gets you something else. You just don't want to be cold and in pain. Another distinction that is sometimes used to argue for egoism, I think this one is worse. It's on less good footing, but I'll explain it. It draws on the distinction between a proximate explanation and an evolutionary explanation. Now, frustratingly, you will see elsewhere in the literature this called an ultimate explanation, but it's not in the same sense as ultimate desire that I said earlier. But just so you can make connections to other things that you read, this is often called an ultimate explanation. But it just means evolutionary explanation. So here's the distinction. Suppose Bob is hungry and he eats a donut. Or I'll do some more. He eats a steak. So approximate explanation means explaining his behavior in terms of the immediate context. All of the causes immediately impinging on him eating the steak. So it could include hormones, his brain states, it could include the smell of steak triggering various reactions inside of him. All of that would fall under proximate explanation. So, why is Bob eating that steak? If you appeal to proximate explanation, you talk about things like that. An evolutionary explanation would take a step back and ask, okay, why does Bob have these sorts of desires at all? What gave rise to people's tendency to enjoy eating things like steaks? And there, the story is going to be something like this. Anyone who had genes that made them not like eating food, those genes didn't make it. Those genes did not get passed on. We are designed by evolution to prefer eating food. Again, because anyone who didn't pass on their genes. You give a very similar explanation for things like sexual desire, fear of heights. These are things that anyone who didn't pass on their genes. So here's something that's true. When it comes to evolutionary explanations, in a certain sense, those are always selfish, from the gene's eye view. Evolution is all about genes that give rise to traits that increase the gene's chances of being spread. Those are the genes that tend to get spread more. Evolution is not about helping other people pass on their genes. Right? One of the most famous expositions of evolutionary theory is The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, and he explains this is how it works. But what people falsely sometimes infer is because evolution is a selfish process, therefore our motivations must all be selfish. And that's another non sequitur. So here's an example that should be easy to understand. Think about maybe the paradigm case of pure love, like the love of a mother for her child, right? So there's a pretty straightforward evolutionary explanation to be told about that. Or you could say parents for children. Namely, especially when it comes to mammals, and humans even more so because babies are so vulnerable, Genes which predispose people to not caring for their children, those genes do not get passed on. They're like, he's crying, oh well, what can you do? No genes passed on from anyone who had that kind of tendency. But that doesn't mean that at the level of the person's psychology, like what they're immediately thinking about when they're caring for their kid, they're not thinking, oh yes, I must do this because it will increase my chance of spreading my genes. What they're thinking is, oh, I love my child. Right? That's what's at the level of proximate explanation. What evolution does is it shapes the kind of emotional tendencies we have, and it does so for, quote, selfish reasons, but the motivations it gives us need not be selfish. The way the book distinguishes this is it distinguishes the content of a mental state, which relates to proximate explanations, with the function of a mental state. The content of the mental state of the parent looking at their child is, oh, I love my child, I don't want them to suffer. Yes?
So, talking about the evolutionary perspective, it says that all actions are always selfish, but in some ways it's selfish for your own genes, not for yourself as an individual. Well, not in some ways, that's how it works, right? So is there an argument to be made that that's not even necessarily entirely selfish, because if the self is the individual, you're not actually doing it for yourself?
Good, yes. So I would say it a bit differently than we said at the beginning. It's not that all actions are selfish, it's that evolution is a selfish process in the sense that things that benefit the genes get passed on, not things that help other genes. But you're exactly right that that's selfish from the gene's eye view, not from the point of view of the human mind or the human individual. And indeed, in the mother case, yeah, like your kid shares your genes. So evolution is going to design you, in fact, to be unselfish from the point of view of an individual person. So yeah, that leads into this difference where, yeah, the content is what's in the person's head. The function is the reason it was selected for by evolution. The book gives the example of pain. So if you touch a hot stove, why do you pull your hand away? Oh, well, in fact, technically you pull your hand away before you feel the pain. But let's say, why do you go, ow, that hurts, or whatever? From the point of view of the content, you're doing that because you feel the pain. You're behaving in the ways that you do because of this mental state. The function of it is to ensure that your body stays alive long enough to pass on your genes. People who damaged their body all the time and didn't care, again, didn't pass on their genes. But that's not what you're thinking about. When your hand's hurting, when your body's damaged, you're not thinking, wow, this will prevent me from having kids. That's not what you're motivated by psychologically. Okay. Any questions about this distinction? Okay, we'll watch a video. Paul Bloom will here talk about psychological egoism. He'll make some similar points and some points of his own, but I think it'll help summarize what we've said. Okay, so the last thing that we'll talk about today is the two Batson papers. So, as I said, these are also papers that I won't test you on these terms, but these are good, these are things you could use for one of the questions. Additionally, they may help give you ideas for your paper. So, as a little reminder, I know you'll be focused on the test for the next week or so, but you should start to think about paper topics. And remember that one section of it will be putting forward a research proposal, something you could test. And Batson in these papers has lots of clever little ways of testing his hypotheses, and that's a good reason to have a look at it if you decide to write on something similar. So these are very clever studies. I won't go through every single manipulation he does, but it'll be useful for giving you ideas. So these two papers are some of the most widely cited papers in specifically moral psychology, and they were both published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is the top journal in the area. But I do want to note up front, even though the methods are very clever, I don't have a lot of confidence in the results for one reason, And if you flip through, it'll become obvious pretty quickly, the sample sizes. You used to be able to get away with a lot in social psychology. So often there will be 4 conditions, and there's like 10 to 15 people in each cell. Even if you have a very rudimentary understanding of statistics, you should know that's not good enough. And especially, sometimes he will draw conclusions about an effect he didn't find. So like there was no significant difference between these 2 conditions. And I said, well, yeah, no kidding, you had 10 people in each condition. I'm not sure how much weight to really put on that. Having said that, some of the methods are quite cute, and we'll give you potentially ideas for other experiments. So Batson's hypothesis is that altruism, helping others, is motivated by empathy. That when you help someone, it's because you feel their pain or you put yourself in their shoes, and as a result of that, you want to help them. That's the sort of proximate explanation, that empathy is the main driver of niceness. It may have evolved through reciprocal altruism, kin selection, these various other things, but at the level of our psychology, empathy is the main driver. And what he wants to do is to test this against various egoistic alternatives. So he's translating egoism into being a testable hypothesis. So one possibility is that what people want is to avoid being distressed, right? When you watch someone suffer, it's kind of distressing, and what people are motivated by is avoiding that. And that would be a kind of selfish motivation. It's not that you actually care about the other person's pain, you just want to avoid your own distress of seeing them in pain. So in the first paper, what he did is he manipulated 2 different independent variables. Everyone watches someone else suffer. That's what everyone in the study does. And you have some way of helping them. I forget exactly what, but there's some way of helping them. One thing he manipulates is difficulty of escape. So some people can very easily just leave or stop viewing the person suffering. And in another condition, it's harder to leave. The other thing he manipulates to get empathy going is similarity. So you tell them something about how similar this person is to you, which, as we'll see later, is known to be associated with empathy. The more similar you are to someone, the easier it is to feel their pain or put yourself in their shoes. And what he found was there was a main effect of similarity. So manipulating something that we know increases empathy does make people help more, but difficulty of escape made no difference. So making it easier for people to avoid looking at the distress doesn't change how much they help or don't help. In brackets, I'm not sure how much weight to put on that because the sample sizes are so small. There might still be an effect there that he didn't detect, but that's what the paper found with their very small sample. The other paper, the 89 one, very similar very similar hypothesis he wanted to test, which is negative state relief. So the idea is watching someone suffer makes you feel sad, you want to be less sad. So what he did, instead of make it easier to escape, was he gave them an anticipated mood enhancement. So people are in 2 conditions. In one condition, you tell them, you're going to see a happy video after this is over to boost your spirits. And if helping people is all about reducing your internal negative state, that should make them less likely to help. Like, yeah, I feel bad now, but I'll see a happy video in a bit. So I don't really need to help to get rid of this negative state. And again, consistent with his hypothesis, that made no difference. Making people aware that they would be made happy later, that didn't make them less likely to help. So these are some different things you could use as arguments against egoism in one of the short answers, both the Feinberg paper and the 2 Batson papers. Okay, let me just look at the book, see if I missed anything. Okay, I'll just close by saying, next class, which is the last class of content, we're going to look at two different papers, one of which is Paul Bloom, arguing that empathy is not all it's cracked up to be. So Batson thinks empathy is great, it's the main driver of altruism. Paul Bloom is going to say empathy has various problems, and then the last paper we'll look at is a neuroscience paper looking at the difference between empathy and other morally types of moral states like compassion. So that's what we'll see next class. Any final questions about today's content? Okay, so we'll finish a bit early. I'll stick around if you have questions. And a reminder, there's no office hours on Friday.